just a laugh. Have you ever noticed how your own laughter sounds different when you're completely alone? Not just the echo. Something deeper. Something that makes you question if that sound actually came from you at all. My name is Sarah, and I need to tell you about the night I discovered that some sound should never be made in isolation. Because what I thought was my salvation became everyone else's nightmare. And now, sitting here in the dark, I can't tell if that faint chuckling I hear is coming from the walls or from somewhere inside my chest. It started 3 months ago when I moved back to my childhood home in Cedar Falls. Mom had been gone for 2 years, and the house sat empty, collecting dust and memories I wasn't ready to face. The neighbors whispered about the poor girl who came back, but I needed the silence. My comedy career had crashed spectacularly in Chicago. Bummed sets, hecklers, that viral video of me freezing on stage. The internet had labeled me comedy's biggest failure, and every morning felt like drowning. The house felt different. Smaller. The kitchen where Mom used to hum while cooking now held only the ghost of burnt coffee and regret. My old bedroom, painted pink with stars on the ceiling, looked like a museum exhibit of a childhood I barely remembered. But it was quiet. Finally. Blessed quiet. The first week passed normally. I unpacked boxes, avoided mirrors, and survived on cereal and takeout. The neighbors kept their distance. Mrs. Henderson, next door, would peek through her curtains, but never wave. The mailman left packages by the gate instead of the door. I told myself it was grief, that small towns treat returning failures like wounded animals. But then I started talking to myself. Not unusual, right? Everyone does it. Except my conversations became longer, more detailed. I'd narrate my day like I was performing for an invisible audience. And now, Sarah opens another can of soup, I'd say, stirring the pot. Thrilling content, folks. The jokes felt good, familiar, safe. That's when I first heard the response. It was subtle. A soft chuckle from somewhere behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but the kitchen was empty. Just shadows dancing in the late afternoon light. I convinced myself it was the old pipes, the house settling. Old houses make strange sounds. But it happened again the next night, and the next. I'd crack a joke about my pathetic dinner, and somewhere, always just out of sight, something would laugh, not mockingly, appreciatively, like I had the most devoted audience member in the world, hanging on every word. The loneliness I'd been carrying started to lift. For the first time in months, I felt heard, appreciated. I began performing longer sets in the living room, using the coffee table as a makeshift stage. The invisible audience was perfect. They laughed at all the right moments, never heckled, never filmed me for ridicule. My material got sharper, darker. I joked about my failures, my mother's death, the way people looked at me like I was contagious. And each punchline was met with that warm, encouraging laughter. It felt like coming home. That's when the neighbors started avoiding eye contact completely. Mrs. Henderson stopped peeking through her curtains. The mailmen began leaving packages at the end of the driveway. When I waved to old Mr. Garcia while watering his garden, he dropped his hose and hurried inside. I didn't understand until I saw the recording. 3 weeks into my comeback tour for an audience of 1, I decided to film myself. Not for posting, just to see if I could recapture that spark that had once made me semi-famous. I set up my phone on the mantle and launched into my best material. 20 minutes later, I watched the playback. And I understood why the neighbors were afraid. On camera, I was alone. Completely alone. But the audio captured everything. My voice, confident and animated, followed by long pauses where I nodded and smiled at nothing. Then came my responses to jokes I hadn't made, laughter at punchlines that never existed. I looked insane. Worse than insane. I looked possessed. But here's the thing that made my blood freeze. I could hear the other voice on the recording. Faint like an old radio transmission, but unmistakably there. It was my voice, but different. Older. Hungrier. And it was telling jokes I'd never heard before. Jokes about the neighbors, about their private fears, their secrets. Mrs. Henderson's husband didn't die of cancer. The voice whispered between my real words. She helped him along, checked the garden shed. I deleted the video immediately, but I couldn't delete what I'd heard. That night, unable to sleep, I crept to my bedroom window and looked across the yard. Mrs. Henderson's garden shed stood in the moonlight, its door slightly ajar. I'd never noticed it before. How the earth around it looked freshly turned, how no grass grew in a perfect rectangle nearby. The laughing in my head grew louder. Over the following days, I tried to stop the solo performances, but the silence felt wrong now, incomplete. The house pressed in around me, demanding entertainment, and when I finally gave in, the invisible audience had grown. I could feel them in the corners, breathing in the walls, waiting for the show. The jokes became predictions. I'd make a throwaway comment about the mailman's drinking problem, and the next day he'd be arrested for DUI. I'd quip about the pastor's wandering hands, and by Sunday, 3 families had left the congregation. The laughter that followed these revelations wasn't mine anymore. It was older, deeper, hungry for more. I started researching the house's history. What I found made everything worse. In 1987, a woman named Margaret Chen lived here alone. She'd been a performer too, children's birthday parties, small theater groups. The neighbors described her as funny but troubled. She talked to herself constantly, they said. Heard voices. The last entry in her journal, found after she disappeared. They're not imaginary anymore. The audience is real. They want more than laughter now. They want souls. Margaret vanished on a Tuesday night. The neighbors reported hearing applause coming from her house until 3 a.m., but when police arrived, they found only silence and the lingering scent of something that wasn't quite sulfur, wasn't quite decay. I know I should leave. Pack up, move back to Chicago, find a normal job. But I can't. Because the truth is, I've never been funnier. Never felt more alive on stage. And there is a stage now, not just the living room, but something vast and dark that appears when I close my eyes. Rows upon rows of shadows, applauding, demanding more. Last night I performed my best set ever. Jokes that made the invisible audience roar with delight. And when I opened my eyes, Mrs. Henderson was standing in my living room, her face blank, her mouth stretched in an impossible smile. "Your turn to visit," she said in that other voice, the hungry one. "We've been waiting so long for a real comedian." I blinked, and she was gone. But on my coffee table sat a single ticket, ornate and yellowed. Admission to the final show. Audience participation required. I'm holding it now as I tell you this. The paper feels warm, alive, and I can hear them gathering outside. Footsteps on the porch, whispers through the walls, that familiar laughter building like a storm. They want me to perform one last time. For everyone. The whole neighborhood, the whole town. A comedy special where the audience becomes part of the act permanently. I think I'm going to do it. Because the alternative, the silence, the loneliness, is so much worse than whatever's waiting on that stage. But here's why I'm telling you this. If you're listening to this story alone, in the dark, and you find yourself laughing, stop. Right now. Because they're listening too. And once they hear you, once they know you understand the joke, they'll start writing material just for you. Turn on the lights. Call someone. Do anything except laugh alone. Because the last laugh was never meant to be yours. Listen carefully to the silence after this story ends. If you hear even the faintest frequency. Have you ever wondered what happens when you hear something you're not supposed to? When does the static between radio stations carry more than just noise? I used to think insomnia was my biggest problem. 3 months of sleepless nights, tossing in my cramped studio apartment while the city hummed outside my window. The prescription pills stopped working weeks ago, leaving me staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks that seemed to multiply in the darkness. That's when I discovered the late-night radio show on 107.7 FM. It wasn't supposed to exist. The station officially went off-air at midnight, switching to automated classical music until 6 a.m. But around 2:47 a.m., if you tuned in just right, you'd catch something else. A voice, soft and hypnotic, reading what sounded like personal confessions, real ones. The kind of secrets people whisper to therapists or carry to their graves. I stumbled onto it by accident, fumbling with my old radio during another sleepless night. The static cleared, and suddenly I heard a woman's voice, trembling, as she described finding her husband's body. Not a news report or a drama, something raw, intimate. The details were too specific, too broken to be fiction. I should have turned it off. Instead, I leaned closer. Night after night, I found myself waiting for 2:47 a.m. The confessions varied. A man admitting to leaving his daughter at a gas station when she was 7. A teenager describing the accident that killed her best friend. An elderly woman revealing she'd been poisoning her neighbor's cat for months. Each story lasted exactly 13 minutes. No commercials, no station identification. Just pain, served in perfect portions. The strangest part, I recognized some of the voices. Mrs. Chen from 4B, confessing to stealing her dead sister's identity. Marcus, the security guard from my office building, describing how he'd been watching female tenants through hidden cameras. Sarah, my ex-girlfriend, admitting she'd never loved me, that our entire relationship had been an experiment to see how long she could manipulate someone. I told myself it was coincidence. Voices sound similar in the static. But when Mrs. Chen's confession mentioned the exact pattern of her kitchen wallpaper, the one I'd glimpsed when she'd accidentally left her door open, doubt crept in like cold air through a crack. I started recording the shows on my phone, playing them back during daylight hours when the world felt safer. The audio quality was strange, layered with frequencies that seemed to burrow into my skull. Listening too long gave me headaches, but I couldn't stop. Each confession felt like a puzzle piece, revealing the hidden architecture of everyone's shame. Then came the night when I heard my own voice. I killed him, my voice said through the static, calm and matter-of-fact. Not with my hands, but with my silence. I could have stopped it, but I chose to watch instead. My blood turned into ice water. I'd never called any radio station, never confessed to anything. But there I was, describing the night in high school when I'd watched Tommy Henderson get beaten to death behind the gymnasium. How I'd hidden in the bleachers, too scared to help, too guilty to speak up afterward. How his parents still sent me Christmas cards, believing their son's friend cared. The confession lasted 13 minutes, like all the others. Every detail is accurate, every emotion raw, things I'd never told anyone. Pulled from the deepest corners of my memory and broadcast into the void. I called the station the next morning, hands shaking as I dialed. The receptionist's voice was crisp, professional. "I'm sorry, sir, but our programming ends at midnight. We only run automated classical music overnight." When I pressed about 107.7, she paused. "That frequency's been dead for 15 years. Equipment failure took it off air permanently." But I kept listening. Every night at 2:47, the confessions continued. More neighbors, more co-workers, more people I passed on the street, all admitting to the sins that kept them awake, the guilt that gnawed at their edges. And sometimes, more recordings of my own voice, confessing to things I'd forgotten I'd done, or things I hadn't done yet. The line between reality and static began to blur. During the day, I found myself studying faces, wondering what secrets each person carried. The mailman who always looked nervous? Had I heard him confess to reading other people's mail? The woman at the coffee shop who flinched when men got too close? Was she the one who described poisoning her stepfather? Sleep became impossible. Not because of insomnia anymore, but because I was afraid of what I might hear. Afraid my voice would return, confessing to new sins. The radio seemed to call to me, its red digital display glowing like a wound in the darkness. 3 weeks later, I noticed the pattern. Every person whose confession I'd heard was dying. Mrs. Chen's obituary appeared in Tuesday's paper. Heart attack in her sleep. Marcus was found in his security booth. Apparent suicide. The mailman collapsed during his route. Brain aneurysm. One by one, the voices went silent. Not just on the radio, but in life. I checked the recordings on my phone, desperate to understand. But the files were corrupted, filled with nothing but static, and a low humming that made my teeth ache. Evidence disappearing like morning fog. That's when I realized the truth. The radio wasn't just broadcasting confessions. It was collecting them, harvesting guilt like a farmer harvests wheat, feeding on the shame that keeps us human. And once it had everything it needed, once every secret was exposed to the void, the source was no longer necessary. I was next. Tonight, as I write this, it's 2:46 a.m. The radio sits silent on my nightstand, but I can feel it waiting. The red numbers seem brighter, more urgent. My phone shows missed calls from a number that doesn't exist. Voicemails that play nothing but the familiar static. The frequency has been calling all day. A vibration in my bones that grows stronger as midnight approaches. I know what's coming. In 60 seconds, my voice will emerge from the static one final time. This time, I'll confess to everything. The real reason I moved to this city. What happened to my sister. Why I can't look at children without feeling sick. The static is starting now. I can hear my voice beginning to form in the white noise, preparing to spill every poison thought I've ever harbored. The radio's display flickers, and I understand now that some frequencies were never meant for human ears. Listen carefully to the static tonight. If you hear your own voice confessing to sins you've never spoken aloud, remember this. The frequency doesn't just broadcast our darkness, it creates it.
Falling tide. What drives someone to walk willingly into certain death, knowing full well they'll never return? Hurricane Elena had been churning offshore for 3 days, her massive arms spinning with the fury of a dying god, yet people kept entering the water. Not accidentally, not foolishly, purposefully. And once I understood why, I realized that the real storm wasn't the one we could see on the radar. It was the one that had been building inside us, all along. You need to understand something before I tell you what happened at Sandbridge Beach that week. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm trying to warn you, because what I witnessed there wasn't just about one hurricane or one beach town. It was about something fundamental in human nature, something that's been waiting in the depths of our collective unconscious, patient as the tide. I was working as a lifeguard supervisor when Hurricane Elena first appeared on our tracking systems. Category 5, they called it. One of the most rapid intensification events ever recorded in the Atlantic. The kind of storm that should have sent everyone running inland. Instead, it drew them to the water like metal filings to a magnet. The first sign something was wrong came on Tuesday morning, 2 days before Elena's closest approach. I arrived at the beach station to find 17 people already in the surf, despite the red flags and emergency advisories. Not surfers. Surfers I could understand. These were ordinary people, families, elderly couples, children who should have been in school. Hey! I shouted through the megaphone, running toward the waterline. Emergency closure. No swimming. Mandatory evacuation. They turned to look at me, and that's when I saw their faces. Peaceful. Serene. The kind of expression you see on people in religious paintings caught in moments of divine revelation. Not one of them showed fear, despite the 12-foot waves crashing around them. A woman in her 60s waded deeper, the churning water reaching her chest. Her husband followed, his eyes fixed on some point far beyond the horizon. When the next wave knocked them both under, they didn't struggle. They didn't surface. That was rescue number 1 and 2 of what would become the longest week of my career. By Wednesday, the pattern was undeniable. Despite round-the-clock warnings, despite police barriers, despite the obvious danger of the mounting surf, people kept coming to the beach. More disturbing, they weren't coming to watch the storm or take photos for social media. They came with a single purpose: to enter the water. The emergency services were overwhelmed. Coast Guard helicopters buzzed overhead like mechanical wasps, pulling bodies from the churning foam. Most were rescued alive but catatonic, staring at the ocean with an expression of profound loss, as if something precious had been taken from them. But some were never found at all. It's mass hysteria, Dr. Rachel Morrison from the County Psychiatric Emergency Team told me during a brief lull on Wednesday evening. She'd been interviewing the survivors, trying to understand what drove them into the water. Group psychology. The storm creates anxiety, and vulnerable people respond by seeking what they perceive as a solution to their stress. But I'd been watching the survivors' faces during the interviews. This wasn't hysteria. This was recognition. As if they had heard something the rest of us couldn't hear. Seen something that remained invisible to our eyes. That night, I decided to stay on the beach after my shift ended. Something was happening here that defied rational explanation, and I needed to understand it. The official line was that we were dealing with panic-induced poor judgment. But panic doesn't make people walk calmly into hurricane surf with smiles on their faces. The beach was officially closed, but that had never stopped them before. I positioned myself behind the main lifeguard station and waited. They came at 2:17 a.m. First, a young couple in their 20s, walking hand-in-hand across the sand as if they were taking a romantic evening stroll. Then an entire family, parents with 3 small children, all moving with the same purposeful calm. Behind them, a group of teenagers who should have been sneaking around town, drinking beer and causing trouble. Instead, they walked toward the water with the solemnity of pilgrims approaching a sacred shrine. But it was the sound that made my skin crawl. Underneath the roar of the storm, underneath the crash of the waves and the howl of the wind, there was something else. A frequency so low it was felt more than heard, vibrating through the sand and into my bones. It pulsed in rhythm with the waves, growing stronger as each set rolled in. I followed the group toward the waterline, staying far enough back to remain hidden. The churning surf was violent, chaotic, deadly. But as they approached, something changed. The waves seemed to organize themselves, creating channels of calmer water, paths that led directly into the storm surge. The young couple entered first, wading in until they were waist-deep. The woman turned back toward shore, and even in the darkness I could see that she was crying. Not from fear, but from joy, from relief, as if she had been searching for something her entire life, and had finally found it. Then the water took them. Not violently, not with the brutal force I had witnessed during the daylight rescues. The waves simply closed over their heads, and they were gone. No struggle, no panic. The ocean had accepted them, like a mother welcoming her children home. One by one, the others followed. The family with the small children, the teenagers. Each group entering the water with the same inexplicable certainty, each disappearing beneath the surface with the same peaceful finality. I should have called for help, should have tried to stop them, but I found myself walking toward the water's edge, drawn by that subsonic pulse that seemed to emanate from the depths of Hurricane Elena herself. That's when I heard it clearly, for the first time. Not with my ears, but with something deeper. A voice that spoke in harmonics older than language, older than human consciousness. It wasn't words exactly, but I understood its meaning with absolute clarity. Come home. The waiting is over. The depths know your name. I stood at the edge of the surf, waves lapping at my feet, and felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of reality. This wasn't a hurricane. Elena was a herald, a gathering storm that served a purpose beyond meteorology. She was calling us back to something we had forgotten, something our species had lost when we crawled out of the primordial oceans and convinced ourselves we belonged on dry land. The water around my ankles was warm, impossibly warm for October in the Atlantic. It pulsed with its own rhythm, and I could see lights moving beneath the surface. Not the harsh glare of rescue boats, but something organic, bioluminescent, beautiful beyond description. You understand now, the voice whispered through the water, through the storm, through the very cells of my body. You see what they saw, what you've always known, but refused to remember. And I did understand. The people who had entered the water weren't victims of mass hysteria or storm-induced panic. They were answering a call that predated human civilization, returning to an ocean that had never forgotten them. Hurricane Elena wasn't destroying. She was reclaiming. I took another step into the surf, then another. The warm water rose around my legs, and with each step, I felt layers of terrestrial anxiety slough away like dead skin. My job, my responsibilities, my fear of death. All of it seemed suddenly petty, temporarily irrelevant distractions from this moment of cosmic reunion. But something made me stop. A memory of Sarah Chen, the little girl I had pulled from a riptide 3 summers ago. The way she had looked at me afterward, with absolute trust, as if I were the most important person in the world. The responsibility I carried for the people who came to this beach, who trusted lifeguards like me to keep them safe. I backed away from the water, every step feeling like I was tearing away part of my soul. The voice in the depths whispered its disappointment, but it didn't pursue. Not yet. Thursday brought the storm's closest approach, and with it, the largest gathering yet. By dawn, more than 200 people had assembled on the beach despite the mandatory evacuation order. They stood in perfect rows along the waterline, facing the hurricane as it churned toward shore like a massive living mandala spinning in the sky above. The emergency response had given up trying to remove them individually. Instead, they had established a perimeter several blocks inland and waited. The National Guard had been called in, but what could soldiers do against people who walked willingly into their own destruction? I watched from the lifeguard station as the sea began to work its transformation. The waves, now 30 feet tall and moving with the force of freight trains, didn't crash randomly against the shore. They formed patterns, geometric arrangements that focused their power into specific channels. The people waiting on the beach moved in response to these patterns, organizing themselves into groups that matched the rhythm of the surf. Dr. Morrison found me there as the first groups began entering the water. "We have to do something," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She had been interviewing survivors for 3 days, and I could see in her eyes that the clinical explanations were starting to crumble. "This isn't natural. People don't behave this way." "Maybe they do," I said, watching a group of elderly residents from the Sunset Manor assisted living facility support each other as they waded into the churning foam. "Maybe this is the most natural thing in the world, and we've just forgotten how to recognize it." She followed my gaze as the waves closed over the last of the residents. Not one of them had struggled. No one had called out for help. "That's impossible," she whispered. But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her expression. The professional certainty that had sustained her career was dissolving like salt in water, replaced by a growing awareness that human behavior might be far more mysterious than her textbooks had suggested. The storm surge hit at 3:47 p.m., sending walls of water 20 feet inland. But instead of the chaotic destruction we had expected, the surge moved with precision and purpose. Buildings that should have been demolished remained standing, while others were swept away completely. The water seemed to know exactly what it wanted to claim, and what it wanted to preserve. When the surge receded, it took with it every person who had gathered on the beach. All 237 of them. But it left behind something else, a pattern in the sand. A massive spiral that stretched from the dunes to the low tide line. From the air, it looked like a nautilus shell, a Fibonacci sequence written in the language of geology and loss. The official investigation concluded that Hurricane Elena had been a tragic but predictable natural disaster. The mass casualties were attributed to a combination of poor emergency communication, social media misinformation, and the psychological pressure of the storm itself. The spiral pattern in the sand was dismissed as a coincidence of fluid dynamics and coastal erosion. But I knew better. I had heard the voice in the water. I had felt the pull of something vast and patient, and utterly indifferent to human understanding. The survivors, those who had been rescued before they could complete their journey into the surf, were quietly transferred to psychiatric facilities across 3 states. Their condition was described as storm-related dissociative disorder, and most were released after a few weeks of treatment. But I kept in touch with some of them, and their stories were remarkably consistent. They dreamed of the ocean every night, not nightmares of drowning or storm damage, but dreams of floating in warm, luminous water, surrounded by beings of impossible beauty and ancient wisdom. They described cities beneath the waves, civilizations that had thrived for millennia while humanity stumbled through its brief and violent history above the surface. And they all felt the same profound sense of loss, as if they had been exiled from paradise and condemned to live out their remaining years in a world that no longer felt like home. 6 months after Hurricane Elena, I quit my job as a lifeguard supervisor and moved inland, as far from the ocean as I could get. I thought distance would protect me, that what I had experienced would allow me to forget the voice that had called from the depths. I was wrong, because the call isn't limited to hurricanes or coastal waters. It exists everywhere water touches the earth, in rivers and lakes, in swimming pools and bathtubs, in the rain that falls on city streets and the tears that fall from human eyes. The ocean is just the most obvious manifestation of something much larger, something that has been patiently waiting for our species to remember what we really are. Last week, I started having the dreams. Warm water, impossible cities, the sense of coming home to a place I never knew I had left. I wake up each morning with salt on my lips and sand between my fingers, despite living in the middle of Kansas. The scientists say climate change will bring more powerful hurricanes in the coming decades. Storms like Elena will become commonplace, churning up from the warming oceans with increasing frequency and intensity. They warn of coastal flooding, infrastructure damage, displacement of populations. But I think they're missing the real point. These storms aren't coming to destroy us. They're coming to collect us. To remind us of a covenant our species made long ago, in the depths of evolutionary time, when we first crawled from the sea and promised we would someday return. The question isn't whether you'll hear the call when it comes. The question is whether you'll have the courage to answer it, or whether you'll spend your remaining years haunted by the knowledge of what you refuse to become. Because make no mistake, it's coming for all of us, eventually. Every major coastal city, every lake community, every place where water meets human civilization. The gathering has already begun, and Hurricane Elena was just the first invitation. Next time you're near water, any water, listen carefully. Beneath the surface sounds, you might hear it. That subsonic pulse, older than language, patient as the tide. When you do, you'll have to choose. And honestly, I'm no longer sure which choice is the brave one. Guardian's price. The first thing I noticed when we moved into the Victorian house on Maple Street wasn't the peeling wallpaper or the creaking floorboards. It was how Belle immediately claimed the hallway, outside my daughter Emma's room. Belle was our German shepherd, 7 years old and fiercely protective. From day one, she positioned herself like a sentinel, never leaving that spot except for necessities. She'd lie there all night, ears pricked, watching the shadows with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "She's just adjusting to the new house," my wife Sarah said, scratching behind Belle's ears. "Aren't you, girl?" Belle's tail thumped against the hardwood, but her eyes never left the darkness at the end of the hall. Emma loved it. At 8 years old, she felt invincible with her bodyguard standing watch. She'd whisper secrets to Belle through the crack under her door, and I swear I could hear the dog's tail responding in soft thumps against the floor. Everything felt normal for the first month. Safe. Protected. Then Belle got sick. It started with lethargy. Our energetic dog became sluggish, barely lifting her head when we called. The vet ran tests, but cancer doesn't negotiate. 6 weeks, he said. Maybe 8, if we were lucky. Belle spent her final days in that hallway, thinner but more vigilant than ever. She'd barely eaten, but she never abandoned her post. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at Emma's door with such intensity, it felt like she was memorizing every grain of wood. The night before we had to put her down, I found Belle standing at Emma's door, perfectly still. Her breathing was labored, but her stance was unwavering. When she saw me, she looked directly into my eyes, not the usual happy dog gaze, but something deeper, more human. She was trying to tell me something. "I know, girl," I whispered, kneeling beside her. "You're a good dog. The best." Belle licked my hand once, then returned to her vigil. We said goodbye the next morning. Emma cried for hours. Sarah and I held her between us on the couch, all of us drowning in the silence where Belle's presence used to be. That night, Emma refused to sleep in her room. "It feels wrong," she said, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Belle isn't there." We let her sleep with us, just that once. At 2:17 a.m., I woke to the sound of claws clicking on hardwood. Slow, deliberate steps in the hallway. The familiar rhythm of Belle's midnight patrol. My heart hammered as I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah or Emma. The hallway was empty, but there in the moonlight streaming through the window, I saw them, wet paw prints leading to Emma's door. I stared at those prints until my eyes burned, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Grief hallucination. Moisture from the heating system. Anything but the truth that was crystallizing in my chest. Belle had come back. Over the next few nights, the signs became undeniable. The clicking of nails on wood. The soft sound of panting outside Emma's door. Once, I even heard the jingle of her collar, the one we'd buried with her. Emma heard it too. "Belle came back to protect me," she announced at breakfast, matter of fact as only a child could be. "Honey," Sarah started, but Emma cut her off. "She growled at the shadow man last night. He was standing in my closet, but Belle made him go away." The spoon fell from Sarah's hand, clattering against her bowl. "What shadow man?" Emma shrugged, returning to her cereal. "The tall one. He watches sometimes, but Belle doesn't let him come close." That night, I set up a camera in the hallway. Footage was unsettling. At 2:17 a.m. exactly, the temperature gauge on the camera dropped 15 degrees. A faint mist appeared at the far end of the hall, moving with purposeful strides toward Emma's door. It settled there, and though I couldn't see Belle's form clearly, the protective posture was unmistakable. At 3:33 a.m., something else appeared. A darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than cast shadows. It moved along the walls like spilled ink, reaching toward Emma's room with finger-like tendrils. But when it got within 6 feet of the door, the mist that was Belle erupted into motion. The camera shook violently, and I actually heard through the speakers, the most vicious snarling I'd ever witnessed. The shadow retreated. I should have been grateful. Should have thanked whatever force allowed Belle to continue protecting Emma. Instead, dread settled in my stomach like a stone, because I began to notice other things. Emma stopped wanting to leave her room during the day. She'd sit by her door, talking to Belle in hushed tones, their conversations growing longer and more intense. When I asked what they discussed, Emma's eyes would glaze over. Belle says I need to stay close. Bad things happen when I go too far. Too far from what? From her. Sarah grew concerned when Emma refused to go to school. Then she stopped eating meals with us, claiming Belle needed her more. Our vibrant, social daughter became a pale, whispering ghost who lived at the threshold of her room. "This has gone too far," Sarah said one evening. "We need to help Emma understand that Belle is gone." But Emma wasn't the only one Belle was influencing. I found myself drawn to that hallway at night, standing just close enough to feel the supernatural chill that marked Belle's presence. She was there. I knew she was there, standing guard as faithfully as she had in life. The protective warmth I'd initially felt began curdling into something else. Belle's devotion had always been absolute, but death had stripped away any moderating instincts. Her love had become pure, concentrated, and increasingly possessive. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. Emma had been in her room for 3 days straight, only emerging for brief bathroom trips. She was losing weight, her skin taking on a translucent quality that made my chest ache. When I knocked on her door, she barely responded. "Emma, you need to come out. You need to eat." "Belle says it's not safe," came her weak reply. The shadow man brought friends. I pressed my ear to the door and heard the soft sound of panting. But underneath it, something else. A low, continuous growl that seemed to vibrate through the wood itself. That's when I realized the horrible truth. Belle wasn't just protecting Emma from external threats. She was protecting Emma from everything. From us. From life itself. Her love had become a cage, and our daughter was wasting away inside it. I tried the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. Not locked. Resisted. As if something on the other side was holding it closed. "Emma!" I called, panic rising in my voice. "Open the door!" The panting grew louder, more agitated. The growling deepened. Sarah appeared behind me, and together we pushed against the door. It gave way suddenly, sending us stumbling into Emma's room. Our daughter sat in the corner, knees drawn to her chest, staring at a point just beside us with hollow, frightened eyes. The room was frigid, our breath forming clouds in the suddenly arctic air. "She's angry," Emma whispered. "Belle's angry that you came in." The temperature plummeted further. Frost began forming on the windows despite the September heat outside. And there, in the corner where Emma stared, the air shimmered with an almost visible presence. Belle was there. Still protecting, still loving, still trapping our daughter in her supernatural devotion. "Belle," I said, addressing the empty air. "You're hurting her." The growling intensified. A picture frame fell from Emma's dresser, glass shattering across the floor. "She doesn't understand," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "She just wants to keep me safe. But I'm so tired, Daddy. So tired." Looking at our daughter, really looking, I saw what Belle's protection had cost. Emma's cheeks were sunken, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. She was fading, caught between the world of the living and the realm Belle now inhabited. I knelt in front of Emma, careful not to move too quickly. The supernatural chill pressed against my back like a warning. "Belle, I know you love Emma," I said, speaking to the presence I couldn't see. "We all do, but love means letting go and holding on causes harm." The growling stopped. The silence was somehow worse. "You were the best dog, Belle, the most loyal companion Emma could have asked for. But she needs to grow up. She needs to live. And you need to rest." A soft whine echoed through the room, Belle's confused, heartbroken sound. The same noise she'd made as a puppy when we first brought her home. Emma looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "She doesn't want to leave me alone." "She won't be," I said firmly. "Good dogs never really leave. They live on in all the love they gave, all the protection they provided, all the joy they brought. Belle will always be part of you, Emma. But she needs to trust that you're strong enough to face the world, without her watching over you every second." The room began to warm slightly. The oppressive presence that had been Belle seemed to soften. Emma stood slowly, walking to the center of the room. She extended her hand toward the empty space where Belle's spirit lingered. "It's okay, girl," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "I'll be okay. You can go now." For a moment, I felt the gentle pressure of a large dog's head against my leg, Belle's old gesture of affection. The sensation lasted only seconds, but it carried with it all the love and loyalty she'd shown us in life. The temperature returned to normal. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. And though I couldn't see her go, I felt the exact moment Belle finally let go. Emma slept in her own room that night for the first time in a week. When I checked on her before bed, she was breathing deeply, naturally, her color already returning. The hallway felt empty now, but it was a good emptiness. A peaceful one. We never saw Belle's spirit again. But sometimes on quiet nights, I catch Emma talking softly to herself before bed. Not the desperate, frightened whispers of her possessed weeks, but the gentle, grateful words of someone remembering a beloved friend. "Thank you for protecting me, Belle," she'll say. "I love you too." And in those moments, I understand something essential about love and loss. True protection isn't about creating barriers against the world. It's about giving someone the strength to face whatever comes next. Belle had to learn that lesson in death. The rest of us are still learning it in life. Sometimes love means holding tight. Sometimes it means letting go. The hardest part is knowing which one your heart truly needs. Mirror ward. Have you ever noticed how hospitals feel different at night? How the fluorescent lights seem dimmer? The hallways stretch longer, and the silence carries whispers that shouldn't be there. I thought I understood darkness, until I started working the night shift at Riverside General's psychiatric ward. 3 months of minimum wage desperation led me to that job, mopping floors and emptying trash bins while the city slept. It seemed simple enough. Clean up after the day shift, avoid the patients, go home at dawn. What I didn't expect was to discover that some reflections show more than just your face. The ward occupied the entire 4th floor of the old wing, a maze of narrow corridors lined with observation windows and reinforced doors. During the day it buzzed with activity, nurses, doctors, and orderlies moving between rooms like worker bees in a hive. But at night, the staff dwindled to a skeleton crew, leaving vast stretches of empty hallway punctuated only by the occasional scream or the shuffle of sedated footsteps. My supervisor, Janet, was a tired woman with hollow eyes who'd been working nights for 15 years. Rule 1, she told me on my first evening, never look directly at the mirrors after midnight. Rule 2, if you hear your name called from an empty room, keep walking. Rule 3, if you see yourself doing something you're not actually doing, find me immediately. I laughed at the time. Hospital superstition, I figured. Places like this attract ghost stories, the way garbage attracts flies. But Janet's face remained dead serious as she handed me my cleaning cart and the ring of keys that would unlock doors I wished I'd never opened. The first few weeks passed without incident. I developed a routine. Start on the west wing. Work my way east, finish in the common areas. The patients were mostly medicated into compliance. Their doors locked, their worlds reduced to small squares of reinforced glass. I'd catch glimpses sometimes. A woman rocking endlessly in the corner, a man writing frantically on invisible paper, another standing motionless at his window, staring at something only he could see. It was during my 4th week that I noticed the mirrors. Every room had one, bolted to the wall above the sink. Safety glass, unbreakable, designed to withstand the desperate violence of minds at war with themselves. But late at night, when the medication kicked in and the ward fell silent, those mirrors began showing things that couldn't be there. At first, I thought it was my imagination, exhaustion playing tricks on tired eyes. I'd be mopping the floor, glancing up at the mirror, and seeing movement that didn't match my own actions. A figure in the reflection continued to clean while I had stopped. A face that looked like mine but older, sadder, more hollow around the eyes. The turning point came when I met David. Room 412 had been empty for weeks. Its previous occupant transferred to a long-term facility after what the nurses whispered about in hushed tones. Something about mirrors, about reflections that moved independently, about a breakdown so complete it required constant sedation. The room should have been cleaned and prepped for the next patient, but the day shift kept finding excuses to avoid it. That's when I found David's file, forgotten in a desk drawer. David Chen, 34, admitted after a psychotic break triggered by chronic insomnia. The intake notes described a man who claimed his reflection was trying to communicate with him, showing him scenes of violence he'd never witnessed, confessing to crimes he'd never committed. The psychiatrists diagnosed him with sleep deprivation psychosis and severe dissociative episodes. But the more I read, the more familiar it sounded. The mirrors showing impossible things. The sense of being watched by something wearing your own face. The growing certainty that the reflection knew things the original person had forgotten. I started paying closer attention to room 412's mirror. It began with small discrepancies. I'd reach for my mop, but the reflection would reach a fraction of a second earlier. I'd turn left, but my mirror self would hesitate, as if considering a different direction. These tiny delays grew more pronounced each night, until I found myself standing frozen in that empty room, watching my reflection live a slightly different version of my life. Then the reflection started showing me things I'd tried to forget. Sarah Morrison, 8 years old. The girl who'd disappeared from our neighborhood when I was 16. I'd been the last person to see her alive, walking home from school along the creek behind the elementary school. I called out to her, waved, watched her wave back before vanishing around a bend in the path. But in room 412's mirror, the scene played differently. I saw myself following her. I saw the argument, the push, the way her small body hit the rocks. I watched myself hide the evidence, lie to the police, attend her memorial service with tears that everyone assumed were grief, but were actually guilt. Except none of that happened. I remembered waving goodbye, going home, eating dinner with my parents, I remembered the search parties, the interviews, the way the case went cold after months of dead-end leads. Sarah Morrison was a tragedy, not my crime. But the mirror insisted otherwise. Night after night, it showed me variations of that scene. Different endings, different choices, different versions of myself making decisions I'd never made. In one reflection, I helped her across the creek safely. In another, I turned away and never saw her at all. But in the most frequent vision, the most insistent one, I was the reason she never made it home. I started researching David Chen's case more thoroughly. The hospital records painted a picture of rapid mental deterioration. A man consumed by guilt over crimes that existed only in his fractured mind, but buried in the intake reports. I found something else. David had been a janitor at the elementary school, where Sarah Morrison was a student. The connection hit me like ice water in my veins. David had worked there. He'd seen her every day, cleaned her classroom, emptied the trash cans she'd thrown her homework into. And somehow, through means I couldn't understand, his reflection had shown him my memory of that afternoon. Distorted, twisted, turned into a confession of guilt that belonged to neither of us. That's when I understood what the mirrors were really doing. They weren't showing distorted reflections. They were showing collected guilt, harvested shame, the dark thoughts and suppressed memories that people carried like poison in their souls. The psychiatric ward was full of damaged minds, consciousnesses cracked open by trauma and medication. And those cracks had created thin places where thoughts could leak from one person to another. Every patient who'd stared into those mirrors had left something behind. A fragment of guilt, a splinter of shame, a confession they'd never spoken aloud. And those fragments were collecting, accumulating, building into a massive reservoir of human darkness that reflected back at anyone brave or foolish enough to look directly into it. David Chen had been seeing my memories of Sarah Morrison because I'd been carrying guilt over her disappearance for 8 years. Not because I'd hurt her, but because I'd survived when she hadn't. Because I'd been the last person to see her alive, and couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more, should have followed her, should have somehow prevented whatever happened next. The mirrors had taken that survivor's guilt and transformed it into something monstrous, feeding it back to David until he couldn't distinguish between his thoughts and mine, his memories and my regrets. But understanding the mechanism didn't make it stop. If anything, the reflections grew stronger, more insistent. I'd catch glimpses of myself in every shiny surface throughout the hospital. Windows, computer screens, the polished steel of medical equipment. And each reflection showed me a slightly different version of my life. One where I'd made worse choices, hurt more people, carried darker secrets. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in November. I was cleaning room 403 when I heard my name called from the common area. Against Janet's rules, I followed the voice. The room was empty except for the large mirror mounted on the far wall, the one patients used for group therapy sessions. But my reflection wasn't alone. Standing beside my mirror self was another figure, Sarah Morrison, 8 years old, exactly as she'd looked the last day I saw her alive. She was pointing at me, her mouth moving soundlessly, her eyes wide with accusation. And behind her stood David Chen, his hospital gown hanging loose on his thin frame, his face bearing the hollow expression of someone who'd stared too long into the abyss. They were all there in the mirror, every patient who'd been broken by the reflections, every person whose guilt had been harvested and stored in the ward's collective unconscious. They stood in ranks behind my reflection, an army of the damaged and damned, all of them pointing at me with expressions of infinite sadness and rage. That's when I realized the truth that David Chen had discovered too late. The mirrors weren't just collecting our guilt and shame. They were redistributing it, passing it from person to person like a virus of the soul. Every janitor who'd worked the night shift, every nurse who'd spent too long staring at her reflection while washing her hands, every doctor who'd caught a glimpse of himself in a patient's window. We were all connected now, all carrying fragments of each other's darkness. I was seeing Sarah Morrison's ghost because someone else in the ward felt guilty about a child's death. I was carrying David Chen's memories because he'd absorbed someone else's shame about violence and loss. We were all links in a chain of transferred trauma, each person's pain amplified and reflected until it became unbearable. The worst part was understanding that it would never stop. Every new patient, every new staff member, every person who looked into those mirrors would add their own darkness to the collection. The psychiatric ward had become a reservoir of human guilt, a place where the accumulated shame of broken minds created its own reality. I quit the next morning, but it was already too late. The reflections followed me home, appearing in my bathroom mirror, my phone screen, any surface that could show my face back to me. And each time, I saw Sarah Morrison standing beside my reflection, pointing her small finger at crimes I'd never committed, but now felt responsible for anyway. That was 3 months ago. I've tried moving to different cities, staying in hotels without mirrors, avoiding reflective surfaces altogether. But the guilt travels with me now, a passenger in my consciousness that whispers confessions I've never made and shows me crimes I've never committed. Because here's what I learned in that psychiatric ward, what David Chen tried to tell the doctors before they sedated him into silence. Guilt doesn't need to be earned to destroy you. Shame doesn't have to be justified to consume your soul. In places where minds are broken and barriers are thin, our darkest thoughts become contagious, spreading from person to person until no one can remember which sins are actually theirs. So the next time you're alone in a hospital, or a therapy office, or any place where damaged people go to confront their demons, be careful what you see in the mirrors. Because some reflections show more than just your face. They show every terrible thing you've ever thought about doing, every guilt you've ever carried, every shame you've tried to hide from yourself. And once you've seen it, once you've acknowledged that darkness exists within you, it becomes real in ways that can never be undone. The mirror ward is always expanding, always collecting new reflections, new guilt, new reasons for good people to hate themselves. And somewhere in that vast network of transferred shame, Sarah Morrison is still pointing at me, still demanding answers for crimes I never committed, but now can never escape. Look carefully at your reflection tonight. If you see someone standing behind you who shouldn't be there, if your mirror self does something you didn't do, remember this warning. Some guilt is contagious, and once you catch it, you carry it forever. The mirrors are always watching, always collecting, and they're always hungry for new reflections to add to their collection.